Okay, welcome everyone to our Georgia Utech Memorial Seminar, or workshop. It's my pleasure to have Patrick Stokes with us today. Patrick is a senior lecturer in philosophy at Deakin University in Melbourne. He's also held positions at the University of Hertfordshire, University of Copenhagen, and I think at St. Olaf College, no? Yeah. You started here as a summer scholar in what year?
2002.
2002, so he's alumni, and then went on to be with the House Foundation Scholar, so it's like he's an alumni. So he's published many articles in journals, and such as European Journal of Philosophy, Continental Philosophy Review, Inquiry, British Journal for the History of Philosophy, and others. His books include Kierkegaard's Mirrors, Interest, Self, and Moral Vision, The Naked Self, this is 2015, Kierkegaard and Personal Identity. He also edited Kierkegaard and Death with Adam Boobin, and also edited Narrative Identity and the Kierkegaardian Self with John Lippert, no? Yeah. He's also what you call a public intellectual, has publishes all kinds of media outlets, and won in 2014, won the Australian Association Philosophy Media Prize for his work as a speaker on all issues of philosophical importance. He's a very rigorous thinker, an elegant writer, and I think one of the best people in the world for bringing Kierkegaard into conversation with contemporary thinkers. So we welcome him, and great to have him.
Thank you very much, Gordon. First thing I have to do is thank Gordon and Eileen for the opportunity to come back. I arrived here as a House Foundation Fellow this week, or certainly this month, but I think this week 10 years ago. So this paper in many ways is like a real kind of homecoming, not just like in terms of coming back to a place that like Jess and I think of as home, but also in terms of the content of it. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here. Thank you. The first thing that happened when I arrived here as a House Foundation Fellow was that Andy Burgess stuck his head in the office door and said, "Good to see you. You're turning your dissertation into a book while you're here, right?" And I said, "Oh, well, no, actually I wasn't planning to." And he said, "No, you are." And I wasn't going to argue. And that's how a book on reflexivity in Kierkegaard's moral psychology came about, because Andy insisted I turn my dissertation into a book, and good thing that I did. And so some of the themes I'm going to be talking about over the next 2 days return to that work that I was doing then, and have developed in other ways since. The occasion for doing so is that what I'm going to sort of be doing here is road testing some stuff that's going to go into a chapter in a volume that I'm co-editing at the moment with Adam Boobin and Eleanor Helms, called The Kierkegaardian Mind, which Routledge are bringing out, which is going to be enormous. I think it's like 40 chapters long. So why on earth we've agreed to do that, I don't know, but that's what we're going to do. So I've got too much stuff in this. I'm going to have to skip some things and gloss over some things. I'm happy to pick any of that up in discussion or afterwards over a coffee, or later on over the beverage of your choice in one of this town's many fine establishments. But as an outline for what we're going to do over the next couple of days, for today's section, part one, we're going to be talking a bit about the structure of consciousness in Kierkegaard and the structure of selfhood, and looking at that through the lens of some contemporary issues about the egological or non-egological character of experience. And that will then set up a problem, namely this problem of what is it for thought to be reflexive? Does it consist in overt I thoughts, or is it something more subtle or non-reflective? And then that links into the problem, which is both it's an ontological problem and an ethical problem in Kierkegaard about the nature of reflection. So that will be part two. Tomorrow we talk about reflection as both a requirement of selfhood and a risk for selfhood, and the idea of second immediacy or non-reflective reflexivity as a regulative ideal in Kierkegaard. So there's an arc where we sort of go up to reflection and then back down again, or down and up, depending on how you want to think about the direction of travel there. I should just say something before we do this too about the approach that I'm taking here, because it's one that can be a little bit controversial. There are some people, such as our friend and former House Foundation Fellow Jamie Turnbull, who would insist that you can't read Kierkegaard as a philosopher at all. There are others who take the somewhat weaker but still fairly confronting position that you can read Kierkegaard as a philosopher, but you distort him necessarily and do violence, exegetical violence to the text if you try and read Kierkegaard in dialogue with or in relation to contemporary debates in particularly Anglophone philosophy. So my last book did a whole bunch of that. It was bringing Kierkegaard into dialogue with people like Galen Strawson and Bernard Williams and Maria Scheckman and others. And a couple of the reviewers have said, no, you can't do that. You're taking the God out of Kierkegaard, you're just distorting it, it's too far from his original purpose. I think you can do it, but you have to be really, really clear where Kierkegaard exegesis ends and an application of Kierkegaardian ideas begins. So there is a line there, so it's worth noting that. And also, of course, Kierkegaard has an influence on particularly 20th century phenomenology, which is often a very cryptic influence. So sometimes when you're talking about Kierkegaard in relation to these topics, it's not that surprising that you find points of connection or points of synergy, because of course he's part of the background that informs those traditions. When you're bringing him into more Anglophone work, however, it is more a matter of picking up resources in Kierkegaard and saying, hey, look, here's some stuff that fits nicely into what you're doing, or that complements what you're doing, or that complicates and maybe even obviates some of what you're doing. I mean, as often as not, I think Kierkegaard's, sometimes he can be used to contribute to contemporary debates. Sometimes he's also very good for showing us a way out of contemporary debates, by sort of showing us that some problems turn out to be pseudo-problems or involve confusions that you can use a Kierkegaardian vein to try and explicate. So what we're going to talk about is, today, is Kierkegaard and consciousness and the nature of consciousness and where self-consciousness or self-reflexivity comes in. As you'll see in a moment, in Sickness Unto Death, Anticlimacus does in fact conflate consciousness and self-consciousness. He seems to talk about them as more or less the same thing. I'm not going to go into this stuff, but there is, of course, a very heavy discussion on what makes a particular act of, or a particular mental event or mental act self-conscious or not. There are a whole bunch of different views on this. And one way of thinking about those differences, and this is the lens that I'm going to apply to Kierkegaard today, is to think about consciousness in terms of an ongoing debate. And when I say ongoing, this goes right back to Husserl. Ongoing debate as to whether or not we should view consciousness as intrinsically egological or as intrinsically anonymous. And this is a divide on which you can find partisans to this day. You'll find people who hold to various positions on both sides of those divide. Two very different approaches. One says that consciousness is fundamentally personal or fundamentally egological. That is, experience is always experience for someone, and that's an intrinsic and structural feature of consciousness. And so there's always a sense of self built into consciousness. There's always a sense that this is my consciousness. There's a sense of personality, if you like, built into consciousness. Should I be worried about that?
I planned it.
First Wednesday of every month.
Oh, okay. Oh, right. That's okay. So if we are all going to die, just let me know. This is frankly how I always saw myself going, but actually we are all going to die, but just maybe, hopefully not in the next hour or so. So, and one of the arguments here is that if consciousness wasn't like that, if it didn't have an intrinsic sense of mindness or first personalness to it, or a sense that all experience is my experience, then self-awareness, reflective self-awareness would be impossible. We'd be self-mind blind. If somebody says to you, what were you thinking about just now, you wouldn't be able to answer that question. That's one approach. The other approach sees consciousness as fundamentally anonymous. So the anonymous approach says that consciousness could be anyone's. Any given consciousness doesn't come with any internal markers that mark it out as anyone in particular's consciousness. This is a Humean approach, right? You know, Hume famously said, when I introspect and look into myself, I see lots of ideas and impressions, but I don't see an I there. I don't see this thing called David Hume floating around in there. I just see these various impressions. So that also has a lot of adherence today, this idea that, and this goes back to particularly Sartre, Gerswich, and also the earlier Husserl. The later Husserl, by the time he actually comes to publish the ideas, is very much, and says that there's an ego in consciousness. Sartre denies that, Gerswich denies that, and you can still find today people like Schiff, for instance, who say that self-consciousness is a generally unactualized but always actualizable potential. In other words, we're not self-conscious most of the time. It's only when we reflect on ourselves that consciousness becomes self-aware or self-conscious. The rest of the time, it's just an anonymous play of impressions and ideas. That's a kind of back of the cornflakes packet version of this discussion, but that gives you an idea. So where does Kierkegaard fit into all this? So Kierkegaard doesn't actually say a huge amount about consciousness, which is quite interesting. Even though it is clearly a central kind of concern of his, he doesn't explicitly say a great deal about consciousness. In part, I think that's because in 19th century Danish, bevidsthed is a new arrival. It's a Danicization of the Danish Bewusstheit. It's a technical term. Kierkegaard, when he uses technical philosophical terms, very often doesn't have good things to say about them, particularly the newfangled German ones. He's much more happy taking good, everyday, household Danish terms and investing them with a kind of philosophical heft or philosophical patina. So he doesn't say a huge amount about consciousness, but when he does, it's a really important topic. And of course, as you know, it takes up that really, really short and schematic, but really rich and fascinating pars secunda of De Omnibus Dignitandum Est, which is unfinished. It's an abandoned work, it's an abandoned fragment, but nonetheless, what's in that structure and that discussion of selfhood is actually really important for understanding, structure of consciousness, really important for understanding Kierkegaard's structure of selfhood and for understanding other things that ramify, I think, all the way through Kierkegaard's account of moral psychology and of selfhood. So a couple of important quotes from that. One in Concept of Anxiety, where we're told that consciousness exceeds conceptualization or resists conceptualization in much the same way as existence itself always escapes or recedes conceptualization, resists conceptualization in the postscript. Right, so in the same way in the postscript, existence is always a surd, it's a leftover, it's a remainder. Once you've thought actuality, there's still existence left over. In the same way, in Concept of Anxiety, we're told the most concrete consciousness that jet lag. Any errors today down at jet lag. The most concrete content that consciousness can have is consciousness of itself, of the individual himself. Not the pure self-consciousness, but the self-consciousness that is so concrete that no author, not even the one with the greatest power of description, not the one with the greatest powers of representation, has ever been able to describe such a single self-consciousness, although every single human being is such a one. So he's doing two things there. First of all, he's taking the word consciousness off the Germans. Right? He's taking it off Fichte and Hegel and their discussion of consciousnesses in this kind of absolutizing terms and saying, no, in fact, consciousness is this irreducibly concrete thing all of us have, and for that reason it resists conceptualization. So that's already an important kind of change of topic in some ways, and you'll see why that becomes important. By sickness unto death, consciousness, when it reappears, becomes actually central to self-constitution. So there's a crucial passage in Sickness Unto Death. Generally speaking, consciousness, that is self-consciousness, again, as I say, there's that conflation of consciousness and self-consciousness, is decisive with regard to the self. The more consciousness, the more self. The more consciousness, the more will. The more will, the more self. A person who has no will at all is also not a self. But the more will he has, the more self-consciousness he has also. So there's some interesting implications here. So suddenly consciousness and will and selfhood are all co-constitutive in some way. So consciousness is intrinsic to self, and these are apparently scalar terms. You can be more or less a self. You can be more or less conscious. That's also an interesting point for reasons that I hope will become clear. So let's talk about De Omnibus Dignitandum Est. There's a whole bunch of hopefully familiar looking photos from Kierkegaardian places around in these photos. In that rich but unfinished section of De Omnibus Dignitandum Est, Kierkegaard, in the voice of Johannes Climacus, actually it's reported of Climacus, it's not Climacus' voice himself, distinguishes between mere sentience or sense perception and consciousness itself. Right? So he says that consciousness is not just sentience, it's not just perception, it's not just experience. He says in consciousness there is more. So there's something that differentiates consciousness from mere experiential contact with the world. And that puts children and animals in quite a complicated position. So in the papers in the B series of the Pera, he says, well, you can talk about animals, or the consciousness of animals, he said that'd be a controversial thing to do. With children, he says, look, okay, they are conscious, but they're conscious in a way that is not qualified. That is to say, they're only immediately conscious. He then goes on to set up what consciousness is in a way that actually seems to imply there can be no such thing as immediate consciousness. So children in particular fall into quite a complicated or problematic category here in terms of understanding consciousness, as they do for contemporary phenomenologists. Right? So phenomenologists like Dan Zahavi, who you'll see kicking around in this talk today, the status of infants or pre-linguistic infants is actually quite a complicated thing. Do they have a minimal sense of self or not? Do they have a sense of self and other, and so forth? Okay, so there's something that differentiates animal consciousness, pre-linguistic infant consciousness, and the sort of consciousness attaching to anyone who's reading this book. Right? So what is that? What is that more that arises in consciousness? So to go back to this question that we're going to use to frame the discussion today, is that more the interpolation of an ego? That is there some kind of self that arises in consciousness that differentiates consciousness from mere experience? Or does that more leave consciousness intrinsically anonymous? Right? Does it add an ego pole, if you like? So one thing too, I'll just say, by the way, is this an example of the way in which you can use Kierkegaard to sort of deflate questions of this sort. One question that arises from that discussion of infants and animals is there's suddenly an ontogenetic question, right? If there's more in consciousness, or to use Klimacus' language, if there's some qualification of consciousness that the infant lacks but that the fully conscious adult has, how do we go from A to B? How do children become conscious? How do they acquire consciousness? So there's an ontogenetic question there. What changes? And I'll show you how we can sort of use Kierkegaard to defang that question in a moment. So, in Del Nus Dubitandum Est, we're told that, first of all, there's a thing called reflection, and the categories of reflection are always dichotomous. For example, ideality and reality, soul and body, to know the true, to will the good, to love the beautiful, God and the world, etc., are all categories of reflection. In reflection, they touch each other in such a way that a relation becomes possible. Right? So we already have this idea that reflection is a relationship between two different elements. Right? But that doesn't really happen on paper, right? That only happens for conscious human beings. It takes conscious human beings to relate these two things. So that only really happens for conscious beings who are interrelating, that is, they're mediating. They're interrelating immediacy, sense data, with mediacy, so with interrelating ideality and actuality. In other words, what we're doing is we're constantly sort of taking raw data from the world, if you like, and conceptualising, that is, relating what we see to our categories. Now, I think here, actually, that if you read Klimacus, because he then says, oh, well, actually, I'll come back to that point. Ignore that. I'll just read this quote here, because it's a really important one. Ideality and reality, therefore, collide. In which medium? In time, that is indeed an impossibility. In eternity, that is indeed an impossibility. In what then? In consciousness. There is the contradiction. So consciousness is already, in itself, a kind of contradictory relationship between two opposed elements, ideality and reality, actuality and ideality, however you want to cash that out. Okay. So it kind of looks like this. And this structure runs all the way through Kierkegaard's thinking. Right, it's the same structure you're going to see again in, it comes up again in Concepts of Anxiety, and classically, of course, it's articulated in that terrifying opening passage of The Sickness Unto Death. Right, you get these, so there's this isomorphic structures that run all the way through Kierkegaard, these triadic structures, where you've got a series of oppositional elements, immediacy, body, finitude on one side, immediacy, the mental, the infinite on the other. Actually, those are on the mental should be on the other side. Anyway, and then consciousness or self is a relation of those things. Right? So you find it in the relationship between ideality and actuality that constitutes consciousness in Johannes Climacus or De Omnibus Dubitandum Est. You find it again in some of the discussion of selfhood in Concept of Anxiety, and it's the structure of selfhood in Sickness Unto Death. There's also references to it in the notebooks. There's somewhere in the notebooks, I can't remember exactly where, Bruce Kermsey told me about this one, where Kierkegaard says something like, my body is weak and my mind is weak, but fortunately my spirit is okay. So there's this triadic structure that runs all throughout Kierkegaard. And of course that structure has important kind of parallels, both philosophical and theological. So it's not hard to sort of relate this back to that classic thesis-antithesis structure that Hegel is caricatured as having. You find it as well in Fichte. But Luther as well. Luther also says that, basically has an anthropology according to which we have mind, body and spirit as three separate elements. But what's really important about this structure, wherever it occurs in Kierkegaard, what's really important is that he doesn't reify the third term, right? So the third term is the relation between the two. It's not a third element. So there's not a thing called a self that relates itself to ideality and to actuality, right? Rather, there is a relation between ideality and actuality that relates to itself. That's selfhood, and that's also consciousness for Kierkegaard. That structure occurs again and again. Otherwise, there'd be four elements, right? There'd be self, ideality, actuality, and the relationship between those. So in this triadic structure, the third element is actually a relation that is somehow reflexive. That, I'll just say, I feel bad saying this in this place of all others, but that is actually one of the issues with, for instance, the way the Hongs translate that section in Sickness Unto Death, where they translate the reflexive psi as, the self relates itself to itself, whereas the more natural would just be the self relates to itself, right? The itself to itself sounds like it's reifying the self as an additional term. Now, crucially for Kierkegaard, there's no pure immediacy. Right? Pure immediacy just doesn't happen. There's no question of a pure immediacy. He says immediacy is precisely indeterminateness. In immediacy, there is no relation, for as soon as a relation is there, immediacy is cancelled. In other words, we're already mediating when we're experiencing anything at all. As soon as you're conscious, you're already interrelating terms, right? So you don't have pure access to immediacy. You can find a similar structure to this in the intermission section of the fragments, right? There's that discussion about awareness. You can be aware of something but not aware that you're aware of it, unless you're immediately aware of it. That came out badly. So there's no pure immediacy, right? Now that already kind of finishes off that ontological question we had. How is it that babies can become conscious or become cells? How can that happen? Well, for us, that question never arises because we're already conscious, right? So what Kierkegaard's talking about is, and this is the thing that I think runs all the way through Kierkegaard, and that this is probably the most important lesson I've learned from Kierkegaard. What runs all the way through it is this concern with philosophizing from a first personal present tense perspective. And I'll say more about this tomorrow. That ontogenetic question is the sort of question you have to turn side on from the self to answer. How do you get from being an immediately conscious or non-conscious infant to a conscious adult or a conscious child? How do you get from A to B? Well, to do that, you've got to turn side on. You can't ask that question about yourself, in a way. Well, you can, but in doing so, you have to, again, turn side on from yourself, right? From the inside, the question of immediacy never arises because we're already caught up in mediation. We're already mediating things. So that ontogenetic question doesn't arise if you reframe the question. It might be a legitimate question for psychologists, right? It might be a legitimate philosophical question there, but it's not the sort of question that you can ask from the very specific existential viewpoint that Kierkegaard is actually arguing from. All right. Another thing that Kierkegaard does in De Omnibus Dubitandum Est is he puns on the term interesse. He says consciousness is interested, and he uses the term interesse, which is an everyday Danish word, but he's careful to sort of make it really clear to you that he's trying to pull apart the two Latin elements there, inter esse, between being, or being in between, if you like. So consciousness, he says, is interested, and that interest, he wants you to note, is a being in between somehow. Now, up to this point, everything we've seen is actually consistent with the non-egological account of consciousness, right? Up to this point, Sartre or Gerswich could say, yeah, okay, I'm sort of on board with this. There's no ego pole, if you like, as an extra element that's arising in consciousness. There's no transcendental ego imposing itself. There's just an interrelation that occurs between ideality and reality. And that is interested because it's in the middle of those things, because it is that interrelation between those two. It's in between them, in media res. But the choice of the word interest is an interesting one. Sorry, the puns are unavoidable. Elsewhere, Kierkegaard uses the much less natural sounding term mellemværelse, being in between, right? Nice Danish term, not quite as familiar, not an everyday term, so less freighted, if you like, with everyday meanings. Why? And he uses that in relation to imaginary constructions. The imaginary construction comes in between the speaker and the hero. Why not just use mellemværelse then? Why use interesse, and why make it so important that he's using this word interesse, interest? And that question becomes even more pronounced because Climacus goes on to tell us that certain fields of study, namely mathematics, aesthetics, and metaphysics, are interestless. They're disinterested, right? So there's clearly more going on in interesse than just in the middleness, right? There's something, so it's a thicker concept. So why use that particular concept? Painting from Eckersberg, Kierkegaard's great contemporary. It's not one of his better works. Looks like something off a bad postcard, but it is actually Eckersberg. So interest means being in between, and he clearly wants to draw our attention to that in-betweenness. But it's also a sort of reflexive reference to the self. What we're interested in is something we're involved in, something that we find ourselves particularly engaged with. So something that we take a relationship to that has a kind of intrinsically reflexive aspect to it. Right? If I say, what are your interests? I'm asking a question about you, not about those topics themselves. Right? I'm asking about a relationship between you and those objects. So interest has an important dual role here. It's both a structural qualification, consciousness is in between these competing elements, but it's also a kind of a subjective orientation. And importantly, it's a subjective orientation that it seems can be lost. So you can see where this ramifies through later thought, right? This connects with also where Kierkegaard talks about Bekümmering, concern, but it also connects with like Heidegger on Sorge and other concepts as well. And importantly, it's something that can be more or less. You can be more or less interested. And you can lose interest. You can try and become disinterested, which sits very awkwardly with its status as a structural feature of consciousness. If it's in between, it's in between. It can't be more or less in between, right? It's just there. So there's already an interesting tension here between the structural determination of interest as in-betweenness and this thicker understanding of interest as a reflexive relationship to something which can be scalar, which admits of degrees. So to be conscious is to be involved in the contradiction between ideality and reality that one is and in which one finds oneself. That is, we find ourselves in this contradictory relationship between ideality and reality, between words and the world a bit more tendentiously, and we find ourselves in that, and we are that relation, we are that tension. Okay, now that's already interesting though, because that seems to be pushing in a more egological direction, right? That seems like suddenly now there is something called a self which is appearing here, and which is self-aware and self-regarding and self-reflexive. So how does that happen? Well, if this reflexivity, interest, is a given property of experience, that is, it's there wherever experience is there, as someone like Dan Zahavi wants to argue. For Zahavi, there's an intrinsic mindness or an intrinsic for-me-ness that's built into all moments of experience. And that mindness or for-me-ness amounts to the figuring of a minimal self in all moments of consciousness or all moments of experience. And Zahavi thinks that holds even for babies. I don't know how he knows that, I don't know how he'd ask them, but nonetheless he thinks that's the case. But if reflexivity of this sort is a given property of experience on that reading, rather than one that appears only in our kind of self-reflective moments when we're thinking about ourselves, then we'll struggle to explain how, for instance, children aren't self-conscious. Shouldn't they already be? And how consciousness and selfhood can be scalar, right? So remember that consciousness and selfhood self-consciousness is constitutive of selfhood for Anticlimacus, and Anticlimacus thinks you can lose yourself. In fact, he thinks most people aren't selves, or aren't selves most of the time. There's a whole bunch of interesting stuff also about the temporality of how that works in Sickness Unto Death, which I'll talk about tomorrow. But there is this interesting question there. How can selfhood be scalar in that way if the reflexivity that makes you conscious and thereby makes you a self is just a given structural feature of consciousness? Does this mean then that interest and therefore consciousness is only present when we're thinking about ourselves? I alluded earlier to Shear's position, which is roughly that. You're only self-conscious when you're thinking about yourself. Right? So most of the time you're just going about your business. It's only when you think, I'm really hot today, or I really wish I hadn't said that. It's only when you're thinking those I thoughts that you're self-conscious. The rest of the time you're not. Is that what Kierkegaard means? It seems to entail we're only conscious when we're reflecting on ourselves. Now, as I say, some philosophers of consciousness do want to defend that view. But firstly, I don't think it's terribly convincing on its face, and secondly, I don't think it's Kierkegaard's view in any case. Not that we should always be bound to Kierkegaard's view, but nonetheless, I personally don't find it entirely convincing. Maybe that's because I've been hanging around Kierkegaard too long. I thoughts. So if it's that we're thinking I thoughts, right, and that's what makes you consciousness, well, that already has some interesting implications, right? One thing is that I thoughts have a certain kind of immunity to error through misidentification. So, she's not here, so she can't stop me talking about her. My wife, Jessica, once insisted that she remembered Cyclone Tracy, which was a huge cyclone that devastated the northern Australian city of Darwin. And I pointed out to her that we were born like 3 years after Cyclone Tracy happened. So she couldn't possibly remember it. And what she remembered was actually a mini-series from about 1984 about the disaster, right? So she was mistaken about what she remembered. But she couldn't have been mistaken that it was her who had the apparent memory, right? You can't be mistaken about that. So consider Stephen Wright, the comedian. One of his throwaway lines is, yesterday I was, oh no wait, that wasn't me, right? The reason that's funny is because it violates a fairly basic intuition we have about immunity to error through misidentification of first-personal utterances of a certain type.
What was that joke again? I didn't hear it.
Sorry? The joke was, yesterday I was, oh no wait, that wasn't me. Right, so think about it. He's a surrealist comedian. I didn't say it was his best work, but... So a quote from Grundbaum and Zahavi on that. So a person cannot think an I thought without knowing and understanding that she is thinking something about herself. Right. And yet Kierkegaard thinks you can. And we do it all the time. I will die. Yeah, I know. Right. I reminded all of you earlier that you're all going to die one day, right? And you probably went, yeah, true. And Climacus's point is that we all think that thought, but we don't actually really understand it. We think of it as I in general will die. You know, Tolstoy brilliantly captures that in Death of Ibn Ilyich. That, you know, I will die. Oh wait, I will die. Not just that Caius from the syllogism in Ketesvaya's logic will die. I will die. So that seems to complicate this picture of immunity through error, through misidentification. How can it be the case that I can in fact think thoughts about myself but be mistaken about who I'm thinking about. Right? If I think I will die but don't really understand that I will die. There is some difference there. Very hard to actually express that difference, right? Other than just saying the word I louder, right? But that doesn't really work. I mean, Wittgenstein says somewhere that pointing harder doesn't actually make an ostensive definition work better. Something like that is true of that I thing too. Just saying, no, you don't understand, I will die, doesn't change the propositional content. It doesn't change the conceptual content of that thought, and yet it radically changes that thought. Radically changes what we're thinking about. Or the other example, and I do love the stories of Soldin, the absent-minded bookseller in the postscript, right? So you'll recall Soldin, there's two of them. One is Soldin, when he got up one morning, didn't realise he was dead. And the other one was Soldin had to stop mid-sentence and say to his daughter, "Was it I who was speaking just now?" Now, Soldin's being presented for comedic effect. He's kind of an item of fun here. He's obviously he was a real person, but he's been turned into a sort of a caricature, kind of like the people of moles that crop up in Kierkegaard's work. And of course, the reason it's funny is for the same reason that, everyone but Gordon finds that Stephen Wright joke funny, that, yesterday I was, no, that wasn't me. It's funny because it violates this kind of immunity to error through misidentification that we seem to ascribe to I thoughts. It seems weird that Soldin doesn't know it was him speaking. There's a failure of self-consciousness. Now, obviously the fact that he's being presented as a caricature suggests that Soldin is meant to be an extreme and probably unrealistic example. I don't think Kierkegaard thought that Soldin really said that one day to his daughter. Or his wife, I can't remember, it was one of the two. But nonetheless, he's meant to sort of stand as an emblem of a real condition that he thinks most of us, and particularly professors, find themselves on, namely dysthyata, absent-mindedness, right? So, absent-mindedness here being a lack of self, a lack of reflexivity in thought. So his idea is that particularly the speculating philosopher, tries to make their thinking objective, and in making their thinking objective in this way, abstract themselves out of their thinking. So the thought that this is me thinking this is missing. So it would be open to a speculative philosopher to say, was it me who was thinking just now? Was it me who was philosophizing just now? As a genuinely live, open question. Complete abstraction, I think, like complete immediacy, is probably going to be impossible. It's going to be a continuum. So there's this interesting kind of volatilization of some of these ideas we have about how I thoughts work. So if we're going to build our account of reflexivity on overt I thoughts, we're going to be in trouble. And I'm going to say tomorrow why I don't think we should anyway, but it seems like that's going to be a problem. One answer would be from Sartre. So Sartre talks about pre-reflective awareness of awareness, or pre-reflective consciousness of consciousness. That is, consciousness is about a particular intentional object. If I look at that projector there, my consciousness is about that projector, but I'm also non-thetically, that is in a non-thematized way, aware that I'm aware of the projector. And if I wasn't, according to Sartre, we'd all be like Soldin. That is, if we were asked, what are you conscious of just now, or what were you conscious of just now, we couldn't answer that question. But for Sartre, unlike Husserl, that still leaves consciousness fundamentally anonymous. Right? It doesn't involve an ego in selfhood, and the ego only arises reflectively. Okay. But that sort of Sartrean non-positional consciousness is clearly not scalar. Right? It's an either-or thing. Either you're pre-reflectively conscious or you're not. And if you're not, you've got a problem, because then you can't say what you're conscious of. Soldin, however, is meant to be absent-minded, and absent-mindedness does seem to be a scalar concept. It does seem to be something that falls along a continuum between Soldin on one end and presumably the deeply self-involved Kierkegaardian thinker on the other. So that's unfair, but so he's meant to fall upon a spectrum, and Soldine's at one end, and then you've got the absent-minded professors not that far along the spectrum away from Soldine, but nonetheless a spectrum. So embodies an extreme of a substantive kind of failure that does appear to be scalar. So that means that subjectivity is going to the sort that's missing in absent-mindedness, the sort of subjectivity that involves this reflexivity, this awareness or this interest, is going to be a thicker concept than just Sartrean pre-reflective awareness of awareness. Okay. So, recall again that really important quote from Sickness Unto Death that I mentioned earlier, where Anticlimacus tells us that generally speaking, consciousness, that is self-consciousness, is decisive with regard to the self. The more consciousness, the more self. The more consciousness, the more will. The more will, the more self. Right. So scalar and constitutive of selfhood. So, what does this thickening of interested consciousness amount to then? Mere reflexive awareness, like Sartre posits, doesn't seem thick enough. Soldine mightn't have that, but the abstracted professor does. That suggests instead that interest consists of some sort of thematized reflection on the self. So the sort of position you might find in, say, Kant or Sartre. That is, you only arise as a kind of artifact of your thinking, right? The self is constructed out of certain kinds of thinking. And this is a thought that ramifies through a whole range of different approaches to selfhood, right? So there are still many analytic philosophers today, for instance, who will tell you that you don't have a self. They might tell you with, say, Anscombe, that your self is just an illusion that's being played, or a trick being played upon you by the grammar that we use to make certain kinds of propositions. Or they'll tell you that the self is just a reflective artifact that doesn't really exist. Or others will tell you that, yeah, the self is real, but it's a thing you construct through your self-narrativization, right? You are a story that you've told about yourself. Dan Dennett, for instance, will tell you that the self is a narrative that you generate out of, that your brain generates, but it's fundamentally fictional in the same way that a centre of gravity is a fiction, but a useful fiction. Others are much more realist about that narrative self, including, for instance, St. Olaf's own Anthony Rudd. But nonetheless, what these ideas have in common is that the self only appears as a kind of artifact of reflective activity. Right. So the self is not necessarily that consciousness. The self is rather a story told by consciousness, or a thing constructed by that consciousness. But that can't be interesting, right? If interestedness and selfhood are co-constitutive, or if consciousness and selfhood are co-constitutive and consciousness is intrinsically interested, that is self-reflexive, self-regarding, then that seems to be a problem. Interest is a property of consciousness as it is in itself. So Climacus, according to Dalnibus Dubertin de Mest, sought to orient himself in consciousness such as it is in itself, as that which explains every specific consciousness, yet without being itself such a specific consciousness. So in other words, he's arguing about the very structure of consciousness, what every consciousness must be in order to be conscious. So that, then, seems to leave us back at we're only conscious when we're thinking about ourselves. All right. Consciousness only arises when we're explicitly thinking about ourselves, and the rest of the time we're not conscious, which would entail that we're only selves when we're thinking about ourselves and constructing this self out of our reflection, rather than being a self when you're not thinking about yourself. Now, I'll leave it there for today. I'm going to go into this more tomorrow. What we're going to look at tomorrow is the question of how that fits into Kierkegaard's overall ethical framework. I don't think this answer is going to fly. It has to be something else. And I'll explain what else I think it can be. But just to sort of foreshadow a bit, if you're only a self when you're explicitly thinking about ourselves, then we have big problems in terms of how we talk about diachronic selfhood, how we talk about selves existing over time. But we also have serious ethical problems, because it seems like selfhood is going to involve a kind of self-absorption or self-interestedness, which is actually going to be antithetical to ethical action. So, we're going to talk tomorrow about reflection, whether Kierkegaard thinks that we can be too reflective or not, and how we might sort of tame reflection, or how we can get from a reflective account of selfhood to an account of selfhood that's ethically sustainable. So, we've done the hard stuff. Tomorrow's more of the fun stuff. Cool. And there'll be a bit of Lustrip and stuff in there tomorrow as well to sort of leaven the mix. All right. Thank you very much.